What's up everybody, I'm Sean Kelly and this is the channel on everything real estate. So after I edited this video, I realized it was way too long for it to just be one video. So I turned this into a two-part series. This is part one and I'll have part two linked right up here. This is why it's important to subscribe, but let's cut to the footage. We are now on chapter 2, property ownership and interest, where we dive in a little bit deeper from the concepts in chapter 1. This is probably the longest chapter and definitely not the most entertaining, but that's what I'm here for. I mean, that is what this entire YouTube series is here for. Speaking of YouTube, there's this really cool feature where you can follow along with some of your favorite channels. And you do that by clicking this little button right here. And the real button is right below this video, so go ahead and subscribe so you can follow along. Also, if you're looking to save some money on your real estate classes, there's a 10% off link down in the description below. Give this video a thumbs up towards the end if you're still enjoying it, which you probably won't be enjoying this video, but thumbs up anyway. Alright, let's get into this. In chapter 2, we'll be covering the following. I'm going to read these off here because there's a lot in this chapter. You can read them off right here, but we have the bundle of rights and appurtenances, water rights, personal property, categories of estates like freehold and leasehold estates, methods of taking title, condominium and timeshare rules, encumbrances and easements, and then a few things in between. The following are included in the bundle of rights, and you can remember what they are by remembering the acronym DEEP C. Like the deep sea. There's really no correlation between deep sea and deep sea, but just remember the acronym anyway. D is for disposition, the right to dispose or sell the property. E is exclusion, the right to keep people off of your property. The other E, for enjoyment, is the right to use without other people interfering. Possession, the right to be in a property. And control, the right to control what the property is used for, to an extent. There's cases where all these rights have their limitations, of course. Take possession, for example. You may own the property, but if you're renting it out to a tenant, you can't just go inside the property. The tenant has rights. And then enjoyment, I mean, there's noise restrictions and you can't go streaking on your own lawn and so on, right?
Sorry, we're going streaking through the quad and into the gymnasium. Come on, everybody!
See, a lot of this exam, a lot of it is just logic. Just think about some of these things. Appurtenance. So we talked about appurtenance a little bit in the first chapter, but let's dive in deeper. There are things that run with the land, not only tangible items such as trees, shrubs, decking, things like that, but also the intangible items, such as the rights, the easements, covenants and restrictions like your HOAs, and things like that. It stays with the land when you buy it, and it'll remain with the land when you sell it. If there's an easement on the property when you buy the property, you're going to get that easement as well. Meaning someone may have the right to drive onto your land to get to their house, for example. Then when you go to sell that piece of land that you just bought, that person will still have that easement to drive through the next owner's property to get to their land. Next, we'll talk about the following rights. These are also appurtenances. You have subsurface rights, you have water rights, and you have air rights. Subsurface rights. So you not only own everything on top of the land and above, but you also own everything that's under the land. Or in the land, can't be underneath the land because land is forever, pretty much. So this includes any gas and minerals and so on. I guess even magma if you go all the way to the center of the core. Those details aren't really clear. Now these can be sold separately from the property. You can own the land but sell the subsurface rights. Think about Texas where you might own a ranch, but you could sell those subsurface rights to an oil company and they'll come and put their oil rig on top of your land. So think about when you go and sell that piece of land now. The buyer who comes in and buys that piece of land will own the land, but they still won't own those subsurface rights. You've already sold them to the gas company, oil company. So a good example to remember this by is by the construction company D.R. Horton. So D.R. Horton is actually headquartered in Texas. And in Texas, where there is a lot of this ranch land and oil rigs everywhere, it's a little bit more common to not have your subsurface rights as a landowner or homeowner. So when D.R. Horton started building houses here in North Carolina, they weren't including subsurface rights in those new homes, and a lot of the new home buyers weren't aware of that. So they ended up getting in trouble for it, and they had to give all of those homeowners back their subsurface rights. That's just a good example to remember and really understand this whole concept. And air rights. Air rights basically means what it says, everything above the land. Some examples would be cell phone towers or the giant power windmills, or your neighbor having a 3rd-story balcony just hovering over your property. So now let's get into water rights. So this is referring to properties that are along waterfronts and really just have to do with where the boundaries actually are for those properties. The 2 big categories are riparian, which are river water rights, and littoral, which are lake, ocean, sea, some of the bigger types of water rights. We have both in North Carolina, obviously. There's really 2 types of boundaries to think about. There's riparian for non-navigable water, like a stream or a creek. The boundary there will be at the exact center of that stream or creek. So if there's one owner on one side, one owner on the other, they have that exact middle to divide their 2 parcels. Now the other type is navigable water, like a wide river or a lake. Now for these types, the boundary is actually at the mean water level, so the average height of water, and this is a fixed boundary. So as water retreats in a time of drought, your property size doesn't expand, it stays at that fixed level. And when we talk about littoral, which remember is the lake or ocean or sea, this is really talking about your property up to that sandy level. You know, imagine a beach, you have your houses, you have the sand where everyone's laying on their blankets and umbrellas. That's the public space, and then you have the water over here. And this is a little side mention, there's something called support rights. Any nearby properties can't disrupt your land by excavating or altering their land. Imagine if your neighbor was trying to dig up this 1,000-foot deep gold mine, right? And they don't support the edge of your property is going to fall into the pit. They have to support that. All right, let's get into personal property now. There's a little bit to uncover here. Personal property is also called chattel. We went over this a little bit in chapter 1. It's also called personalty. And how clever is that? They took personal and property and came up with personalty. Clever. These are all the things like furniture, electronics, even plants if they're in pots that are movable. These do not convey with the land, and this is especially important when we go and talk about fixtures. And now we're on fixtures. Fixtures are things that were personal property but became fixed to the land to become real property and now are permanent. These are now appurtenances. They run with the land. This is the 3rd time we've covered appurtenances. It'll be a test question. Examples would be a ceiling fan that you go and buy at Lowe's. It's personal property. Once you install it, it's real property. Other examples would be a fence, toilet, things like that. The most important characteristic to determine what a fixture is versus personal property is what is the intent? What was that thing intended for? Installing a ceiling fan into the ceiling was obviously intended to be here. Otherwise there would be no light, there'd be no air circulation. Common sense stuff. Fixtures are never determined, and this is really important, fixtures are never determined by their cost, value, or size. Ever. While appliances like a fridge many times come with a property, it is not actually a fixture, and if you want that fridge in your property when you buy it, you must include it on the contract. Now, a fridge is not a fixture. However, think about a dishwasher. What's the difference? A dishwasher is usually plumbed up. It might have some electrical work done. It's typically screwed into the cabinets. That's meant to stay permanently. As a seller, you only need to mention a fixture in a contract if you do not actually want to sell that fixture with the house. For instance, if you have some old hand-me-down wine cabinet built into some wall somewhere in your house, and you want to take that with you as a seller, you must mention that in the contract. Otherwise, the buyer is going to take it with the house. Trade fixtures are another important form of a fixture. The best way to describe this is as an example. Imagine for a second a bakery and their little shelves that they have to display all of their pastries. Now these things are probably hardwired, they're screwed into the floor so when kids climb all over them, they don't tip it over. Who do you think keeps ownership of these shelves? The owner of the building probably isn't going to want to keep some bakery shelves. They're not a baker themselves, they're leasing this out to a baker. So the baker would obviously keep these trade fixtures. Trade fixtures are typically still personal property. The best way to determine what's a fixture is by using this thing called IRMA. As we said, intention is the best way of knowing. Is it meant to be permanent? R is for relationship. Again, think about that baker. Who do you think those display cases should belong to? The owner or the baker? Method, was it wired, glued, nailed, buried into the ground? Adaptation, now this is a very specific one. And the best way to imagine this is thinking about custom blinds that are meant to fit a specific shaped window. This would probably remain a fixture. Alright, so back to personal property. The book seems to talk a lot about plants, so let's get a little deeper into the weeds. Trees and shrubs are fixtures. They stay with the property. Flowers that are in pots are movable and they are personal property. A really weird and specific thing to remember here is that when a farmer plants his seeds and raises his crops, whatever we call it, grows his crops, and decides to sell his land, the new homeowner, the new landowner must allow that previous farmer to go and harvest the fruit of their labor. This is called an implement. Let's talk about manufactured versus modular. Manufactured homes are actually personal property until they are fastened to the ground and then deregistered from the DMV. The axles must be removed and every other step taken for it to actually be affixed to the ground. If the manufactured home is not fastened to the ground or have its axles removed, it must be mentioned in the contract from the seller. So as a buyer, when you're checking out a piece of land and you see a manufactured home on it, it might not actually be included in that piece of land. Modular properties are assembled to be permanently affixed to a land. They are permanent structures and therefore are never really personal property. These don't need to be mentioned in the contract as they come with the land. A couple of keywords to note here while talking about personal property and fixtures. Severance. So fixtures can be taken away from the property or severed from the property. And annexation is when items become fixed to a property. So like planting a tree or planting a shrub or making a deck, for example. And the most important thing to remember when deciding if something is personal property or real property is it movable? So we are at halftime, probably a little past halftime, but that was a lot to take in. So let's do a quick review. The bundle of rights acronym is DEEP C: disposition, enjoyment, exclusion, possession, and control. When it comes to growing crops, if you plant the seed and grow the crops, you can still go back and harvest the land after you've sold it. This is called implements. You've worked hard for those crops, you have the right to go back and harvest those crops. Subsurface rights are the mineral, oil, and gases under your land, and you own it. Air rights are everything above your land. Water rights include riparian, which is river, and littoral, which are lake or ocean side. Non-navigable water, your rights end at the center of the stream. For navigable water, your boundary lines are at the mean high water level. Do you remember what personal property is? Typically things that are movable, and these are sold through a bill of sale, while real property is sold through a deed. Fixtures are items that were once personal property but are now real property. Annexation is changing personal property to real property, like taking fence boards and making it into a fence. Severance is when you take real property and turn it into personal property, such as chopping down a tree and now having wood. This is it for part 1 of chapter 2. Part 2 will be linked at the end of this video, or you can go view it on my channel. Guys, please remember to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'll see you in a little bit.